Have you ever gone to sleep in church? Well, you don't have to answer that if you don't want to. It happens all the time, and it's called the Eutychus complex, and you just heard the story about Eutychus. I love Buechner's description of it. He says, Paul believed that sermonettes make Christianettes, and so once he started preaching, he just kept going until about midnight. And then he remembered a few things he hadn't told them, and so he kept going a little, and he was so impressed with his own eloquence that he didn't hear the bumblebee sounds coming from the little young man there, and he didn't see that his eyes were mostly closed and his mouth was mostly open. But it was the woman's scream when the boy went out the window that got everyone's attention, Paul included. You know, it's a humbling thing for a preacher to put people to sleep. You hear all kinds of things in church. I remember hearing a gentleman in a church I served before shaking my hands at the door, and he had a way of grading how things had gone that morning. Didn't nod once this morning, preacher, was an A. Only nodded once or twice, that was a B or a C. And if he was still conked out in the pew at the end of the service, well, you know what that grade was, which leads us to this New Testament passage, especially the gospel passage, and the sermon for this morning. Because Luke's point and mine are that, like the disciples, the church seems to be asleep about half the time, and it needs to wake up before it's too late. You see, Luke's point is that the transfiguration story is a very important story for us, whatever time we find ourselves. Only when Peter and James and John were fully awake did they begin to see the amazing gift of what Jesus Christ was. Only then did they begin to understand what Jesus was really all about. So the transfiguration story for all of us is a kind of wake-up call. It is a sort of theological alarm that rings round the world. Wake up, church, the transfiguration story seems to say to us. Wake up to the kind of world you're living in, which is no longer the little Christendom that you or your parents or your grandparents grew up in, because great tectonic shifts are occurring in our culture. Edens are falling and Camelots are crashing, and it's almost like a period of the Renaissance. Secular journalists, which are sort of modern-day prophets today, are saying, wake up, church, to the fact that the church's effect on the world is almost infinitesimal these days. The young and the intellectuals laugh at the church for being irrelevant. Business types scoff at the church for being too unrealistic and too idealistic. And minorities and the disenfranchised write the church off for being hypocritical. And in a way, all of them are right. Robert Hudnut once called the church the sleeping giant, and he wrote a whole book by that title. Jesus' question to Peter in the garden, "Are you still asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour with me?" is a metaphor for the church, which is more peripheral when it should be central, which is on the edge when it should be at the center of things. And Jesus' question to Peter, "Are you still asleep?" is a question that points to the drowsy, sleeping giant that Luther and Calvin confronted during the Reformation. It's the same drowsy, sleeping giant that Hugh Latimer and John Knox confronted in the British Isles. It's the same comfortable and sluggish church that Wesley and Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards and Lyman Beecher took on during the two Great Awakenings, both the first and the second Great Awakening in the 18th and the 19th centuries. In fact, in 1802, Timothy Dwight, a congregational minister, preached a series of chapel sermons at Yale University, which resulted in the conversion of a third of the Yale student body, including Lyman Beecher. That whole period of an awakening changed early American history. It brought people back to the gospel in a way they hadn't seen it before. Now, how did they wake up? They woke up because they were not just waking up to the world, they were waking up to the glory of God. Because you see, if you wake up only to the ways of the world, it leads only to despair. It can even lead to depression, what Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death. And so people say, well, we might as well just sleep through it all. Why not? I hear all kinds of things from people who only go to church occasionally. And one of the best I ever heard was a gentleman who said, well, Pastor, you know, you got to understand that the church I really belong to is the Church of St. Mattress, and I just wanted you to know that. Well, I really didn't even know what to say to that. I'm not struck strangely mute very often, but the Church of St. Mattress, I mean, you think if we can just sleep through it all, maybe when we wake up like Snow White to the prince's kiss, then maybe everything will be all right, but it won't. It won't be that much different. You see, when you only wake up to the ways of the world, instead of waking up to the glory of God, there's a difference. You wake up grumpy, or you wake up every day saying, this is the day which the Lord hath made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. No, when we wake up only to the ways of the world, it leads to depression. It leads to Jean-Paul Sartre's nothingness, to Bertolt Brecht's theater of the absurd, because everything seems to be absurd, and we are stumbling around in the darkness, waiting for Godot, wondering when it will come. No, we need to wake up to the glory of God every single day. The way Peter and James and John woke up to the glory of God on that amazing Mount of Transfiguration. And the church provides all kinds of opportunities, reminding us to do daily prayer and to be in weekly worship. The church gives us these beautiful moments of baptism, or the meal around this table, or a hymn, a certain line in the anthem that catches you in a certain way. Holy moments that even the basest sensibilities of our nature are awakened to something deeper and more profound than we have ever experienced before. Which reminds us that we have to experience God before we analyze God. So, says Sarah Weaver, Christianity is as much about an experience of God as it is about believing in God. And you don't have to go up on a mountaintop to experience God. You can experience God in a hospital room, in a homeless shelter, in a walk in the woods on a quiet winter day, or tucking your children or maybe an elderly parent in with a good night song. You know, every once in a while there is something so incandescent and alive that brings a face to life with a glow that is almost beyond the bearing, like Moses' face or like Jesus' face on the Mount of Transfiguration. And you don't have to go up on a mountaintop. You can be all around. You can experience God's presence in many different ways around you. When was the last time you had one of these mountaintop experiences in the middle of your ordinary life? I love the description, William Sloane Coffin, former chaplain at Yale and pastor at Riverside Church, a description of the Berkshire Mountains in upper state New York. I love his description. He said, the Berkshires blazed so that fall that Moses would have turned aside to every bush and tree. What a great description. Have you had that experience where you see the presence of God in every moment, every person you meet? You see a glow on someone's face? You can actually put a glow on someone's face. When was the last time you complimented someone? Maybe someone who's working for you, or maybe a spouse or a friend or a parent or a child. Actually said, you did a great job. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. And you watch the glow on that person's face. It's a beautiful thing to see. When was the last time you did that? Of course, when you see that glow, as the disciples saw this glow on Jesus' face, when you see that glow, The first thing that happens, the trouble that starts after that, is we want to blab about it. We want to talk about it. And that's what Peter wanted to do. Oh, let's make some booths and tell how wonderful our church is. Peter is a have sermon, will travel kind of guy, and he's always ready to market the whole thing. And Jesus says, wait a minute. It's time to be silent. It's important when you catch the glimpse of God, the first thing you know is that you need to be quiet at first. Ecclesiastes is right. There's a time to speak and there's a time to be silent, which is an odd description for evangelism and missions, isn't it? We catch a glimpse of the glory of God and then we need to keep our mouths shut. Yes, that's what Jesus kept saying to Peter. You're talking too much, Peter. You need to slow down and watch for God and listen for God. And Peter's still ready to go market it all. And then this cloud comes, and out of the cloud there is this voice that says, listen to him. This is my beloved son. This is my chosen one. Listen to him. Which means that faith is, first of all, acoustical before it can be really doxological. We don't know what we are praising. We don't know the God we are praising unless we first listen to God and listen for God. We've been talking in the Greek class about the word akouo, which means I hear. Faith is acoustical before it can be doxological. When was the last time you really listened to God? Listened for God? When's the last time you really listened to anyone? I mean, look in the eyes of another person and actually listen to that person. Now, this is a little bit of a confession because, my PhD's in rhetoric, and so I'm a talker, and so I have to work on this all the time. I remember years ago when in another church, we needed to work on growing the church and work on evangelism, and I said, let's go visit some of the people who have been visiting our church. Some of the prospects. Some have been visiting for many Sundays. Let's go check on them. Pick me out an elder to go make some evangelistic calls. And so they picked out this very prominent bankruptcy lawyer in our church, and we're driving along in the car, heading up to the first home. We're going to hit 5 homes in one night, just appear and make an evangelistic call. And he's riding along with me, and he says, now, Dr. Carl, I don't know much about this evangelism. I said, that's all right. Just watch and learn. It'll be okay. We're going to be fine. And we're walking up to the first house on the sidewalk, and he said, Dr. Carl, did these people know that we're coming? Did you call ahead? Oh, no, they don't know. You mean we're like the Jehovah's Witnesses? And I said, no, it's not quite like that, because they've been to our church and they've been visiting, and they'll recognize me from the pulpit. It'll be fine. Let's just go on in. And we rang the doorbell, and eventually this gentleman appeared at the door in his bathrobe, peeking through the door. Oh, Dr. Carl, wow, you're here to visit us all the way out here? Yeah, we want to come talk to you about joining the church. Oh, okay, well, come on in. Fixing up his bathrobe, and he, honey, it's the pastor, come on. We all got into the living room, and before we even sat down, he said, well, this Sunday we're going to join. We were all ready, and you didn't even have to come all the way out here. It's okay. And I said, well, that's fine. I'm glad to hear that. But, I was young, and I had my spiel, and so I had to give my whole pitch, and I gave my whole long pitch. And at the end, he said, well, like I said at the beginning, we're going to join on Sunday. And I said, well, that's great. And I had a prayer, and we laughed, and we're walking down the sidewalk. And I'll never forget, this bankruptcy attorney turned to me, and he said, Dr. Carl, I don't know much about this evangelism business, but I got to tell you, when I'm in the courtroom and the judge pronounced the verdict, I stop talking. And that was my first evangelism lesson from a bankruptcy attorney. When was the last time you actually listened to someone? According to Ver Fritz Hansen, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who endured long lines and long receiving lines and had a lot of problems with it at the White House, he realized that people didn't pay attention to anything he said, what he actually said. So one day, during a reception, he decided he would try an experiment. And he said to everyone who came and greeted him and shook his hands, "I killed my grandmother this morning." He actually said this. And people said things like, "Marvelous. We're so proud of you, Mr. President. Keep up the good work. God bless you, sir." Over and over, he kept saying this. "I killed my grandmother this morning." He got all this praise until at the very end of the line, while greeting the ambassador from Bolivia, who actually heard what he said, not knowing what to say then, leaned over to the president and whispered, "I'm sure she had it coming." When was the last time you actually listened to someone? When was the last time you really listened to God? Wake up, look, and listen. That's what we're all called to do, not only today, but for the rest of our lives. God bless you all.